People always say that no matter what happens, your family will never leave you with nothing. I believed that too, right up until the afternoon I came home and found strangers carrying furniture into the house where I had lived for more than 40 years. At first, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. I slowed my car to a stop across the street and stared through the windshield, wondering why a moving truck was parked in my driveway. 2 men were carrying my dining room table through the front door while a woman stood on the porch holding a clipboard. My heart began to pound. I stepped out of my car and walked toward them as quickly as my knees would allow. "Excuse me," I called. "What exactly are you doing?" The woman smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a neighbor you've never met. "We're just getting settled," she said. "We closed on the property yesterday." I laughed because it sounded impossible. "Closed on the property?" I asked. "This is my house." Her smile slowly disappeared. She looked confused before glancing at the papers in her hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We bought this house from Daniel Collins." The moment I heard my son's name, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me. Daniel. My only child. The little boy I had raised after my husband passed away. The man I trusted more than anyone else in the world. I shook my head. "There has to be some mistake," I whispered. "Daniel can't sell my house." The woman's husband stepped forward, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we finalized everything through a title company. We were told everything was legal." I could barely hear him anymore. My eyes drifted toward the front window where my favorite blue curtains still hung exactly where I had left them that morning. It looked like my home, but suddenly it felt like it belonged to someone else. My hands were trembling as I reached into my purse for my phone. I called Daniel once. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. A third time. Nothing. Then I noticed something even stranger. The locks on my front door had already been changed. I walked onto the porch anyway and instinctively reached for my key. It didn't fit. The woman looked at me with sympathy. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. I wanted to answer, but the words refused to come. I had left that morning to meet an old friend for lunch, expecting to return home and water the flowers before dinner. Instead, I was standing outside my own house like a complete stranger. My chest tightened as dozens of questions raced through my mind. How could this happen without my knowledge? Where were my documents? Why hadn't anyone called me? And why would Daniel do something like this? Finally, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my son. Just one sentence. "Mom, please don't make a scene. I'll explain everything after the wedding." I read those words over and over until they blurred together. After the wedding. As if selling my home without telling me was just another item on a checklist. As if my entire life could simply wait until it was convenient for him. I looked back at the strangers unpacking boxes inside the house where I had celebrated birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and quiet Sunday mornings. They weren't the villains in this story. They believed they had purchased a home fair and square. The real question wasn't who was living in my house. The real question was how my own son had convinced himself that he had the right to take everything I had spent a lifetime building, and I was about to discover that losing my house wasn't even the worst thing he had already done. I stood there for several minutes with my phone still in my hand, staring at Daniel's message until the screen went dark. My mind refused to accept what my eyes had already seen. Somehow, I kept expecting him to call and tell me it was all a misunderstanding. That was the strange thing about being a mother. Even after your heart had been broken, part of you still searched for an excuse to protect your child. As I slowly walked back to my car, memories began rushing through my head with a clarity that almost hurt. Daniel had not always been the man who could send a message like that. He had once been the little boy who refused to go to kindergarten unless I promised to wave from the parking lot until he disappeared inside the building. After my husband, Thomas, passed away unexpectedly when Daniel was only 8 years old. The two of us became each other's entire world. There were years when money was painfully tight. I worked long hours at a local insurance office during the day and cleaned bookkeeping records for a small hardware store in the evenings. Every dollar mattered. I skipped vacations, drove the same sedan for nearly 15 years, and learned how to repair things around the house because hiring someone was simply too expensive. I never complained because every sacrifice had one purpose. I wanted Daniel to have opportunities that his father and I never had. When he graduated from college, I cried harder than anyone else in the audience. I remember thinking that Thomas would have been so proud of the young man our son had become. Daniel found a good job in marketing, rented a nice apartment, and visited almost every Sunday. We would cook dinner together, watch football during the fall, and laugh about old family stories. If someone had told me back then that he would someday become the reason I lost everything, I would have defended him without hesitation. Looking back now, I can finally see that things did not change overnight. They changed one small decision at a time. The biggest turning point came when Daniel introduced me to Ashley. She was confident, ambitious, and always seemed to know exactly what she wanted. At first, I genuinely liked her because she made Daniel happy. She spoke about building a beautiful future together, buying a large home someday, and creating the perfect life. There was nothing wrong with having dreams. The problem was that every dream seemed to come with a price tag that grew larger each month. Expensive restaurants became ordinary dinners. Weekend trips turned into luxury vacations. Conversations that once centered on family slowly shifted toward appearances, social media photos, and keeping up with people neither of them truly seemed to like. Daniel started making comments that felt unlike him. He would joke that my house was worth more than I realized or ask whether I had updated my financial paperwork recently. I laughed those questions away because I trusted him completely. Why would I question my own son? Then, about 6 months before everything fell apart, he asked if he could borrow some documents because he wanted to help me organize my estate planning. He smiled and said he was only trying to make things easier for me in the future. I remember handing him the folder without a second thought, never imagining that one simple act of trust would become the first piece of a plan that I had not even realized was already unfolding. At the time, I thought Daniel was being thoughtful. He sat beside me at my kitchen table with a notebook full of reminders about wills, insurance policies, and emergency contacts. He explained that if anything ever happened to me, he wanted everything to be organized so I would never have to worry. It sounded responsible, and I remember feeling proud that he was thinking ahead. I handed him the folder containing my property records, bank information, and a few other important documents. He thanked me, made several photocopies, and returned everything a few days later. I glanced through the folder, saw that everything appeared to be there, and put it back into the filing cabinet without another thought. Not long after that, conversations began changing in ways I could not fully understand. Every visit somehow circled back to wedding plans. Ashley had chosen an elegant venue outside the city, a designer dress, custom decorations, a live band, and a guest list that seemed to grow every week. Whenever I suggested that a beautiful wedding did not have to cost a fortune, Ashley would smile politely before explaining that people only got married once and that memories were priceless. Daniel usually nodded beside her, agreeing with everything she said. Then he started asking for financial help. At first, it was $5,000 to secure the venue. A month later, it was another $8,000 because prices had unexpectedly increased. I gave him what I could without putting myself at risk because I genuinely wanted to support my son. Eventually I told him that I needed to stop. My retirement savings had a purpose. They were meant to cover medical expenses, home repairs, and the uncertain years ahead. Daniel looked disappointed, but Ashley looked frustrated. She insisted they were only asking for temporary help and promised they would pay everything back after the wedding. I gently refused. For the first time in my life, Daniel left my house without hugging me goodbye. After that day, his weekly visits became less frequent. Sometimes several weeks passed without hearing from him unless he needed another favor. When he did call, the conversations felt rushed and strangely formal. He often asked whether I had spoken to my bank recently or whether I had considered selling the house and moving into a smaller place. He described it as a practical decision for someone my age. I laughed and reminded him that I loved my home. Every room held memories of my husband and the life we had built together. Selling it had never crossed my mind. He did not argue, but there was an unusual silence before he changed the subject. Looking back now, I realize he was not making casual conversation. He was measuring my resistance. A few weeks before the wedding, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly while I was gardening. He offered to help carry groceries inside and asked whether he could borrow my spare house key because he wanted to surprise me by fixing a loose cabinet door while I was out one afternoon. It sounded like exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture he used to make years earlier. I handed him the key without hesitation. As he walked toward his car, he turned back, smiled, and told me not to worry about anything because everything was finally coming together. At the time, I believed he was talking about the wedding. I had no idea he was talking about a plan that was already moving forward, one careful step at a time. The day everything unraveled had started like any other Tuesday. I met my friend Linda for lunch at a small cafe we had visited for years. We talked about retirement, our grandchildren, and the roses blooming in our gardens. I remember checking my phone once and noticing I had missed a call from an unfamiliar number, but I assumed it was another telemarketer. If I had answered that call, perhaps the entire day would have turned out differently. After lunch, I stopped at the grocery store, picked up a few things for dinner, and drove home without the slightest suspicion that my life had already changed while I was away. Standing outside my house after speaking with the new owners felt unreal, but eventually I forced myself back into my car. There was only one place I could think to go. My bank. I arrived shaken and asked to speak with someone immediately. The branch manager recognized me because I had been banking there for decades. One look at my face and she led me into her office. I explained that strangers had somehow moved into my house and that I could not reach my son. She opened my account and frowned almost immediately. Then she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. She quietly asked if I had personally authorized several large withdrawals over the past 2 months. My stomach dropped. I told her absolutely not. She turned the monitor so I could see the transaction history. Tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared in multiple transfers and cashier's checks. Nearly every dollar I had spent decades saving was gone. My hands began shaking so badly that I could barely hold the printed statement she handed me. I insisted there had to be some mistake because I had never approved any of those transactions. The manager hesitated before explaining that the paperwork on file appeared to contain my signature. She offered to retrieve copies for me. When she returned, I stared at the signatures for several long seconds. At first glance they looked like mine. The curves of the letters were similar, and my name was spelled exactly as I always wrote it. But something was wrong. Tiny details were off. The pressure was uneven. The final stroke of my last name slanted differently. It was close enough to fool someone who did not know me well, but I knew I had not signed those documents. The manager immediately froze activity on my remaining accounts and suggested I file a fraud report. She also advised me to contact an attorney because real estate records might reveal how ownership of my house had been transferred. I left the bank feeling numb. My next stop was the county records office. I prayed they would tell me the woman at my house had been mistaken. Instead, a clerk printed the property transfer documents and placed them on the counter. My name appeared on every required page. According to the paperwork, I had willingly sold my home several weeks earlier. The sale had already been completed, recorded, and funded. I could barely breathe as I looked at the date beside the signature. It was the same afternoon Daniel had borrowed my spare key to supposedly repair a cabinet while I was out. Suddenly every strange conversation, every request for paperwork, every question about my finances, and every promise that everything was coming together fit into a picture I had never wanted to see. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was not Daniel. It was an unknown number, and the voice on the other end introduced himself as an attorney who had one question that would determine whether my entire future could still be saved. The attorney introduced himself as Michael Harper and explained that he represented the title company involved in the sale of my house. My heart sank, expecting him to tell me there was nothing anyone could do. Instead, his first question caught me completely off guard. He asked whether I had personally attended the closing and signed the final documents in front of a notary. I answered immediately. No. I have never attended any closing because I never agreed to sell my home. There was a long silence before he calmly said, "Mrs. Collins, that answer is extremely important." He explained that the title company had received a complaint from someone reviewing paperwork after the transaction was completed. One employee had noticed several inconsistencies in the identification documents used during the closing. At the time, they believed everything had already been verified, but after taking another look, concerns had been raised internally. They were now trying to determine whether fraud had occurred. My hands tightened around the phone. For the first time that day, I felt the smallest spark of hope. Mr. Harper asked if I could meet him the following morning with my driver's license, passport, and any documents containing my genuine signature from previous years. I agreed without hesitation. Before ending the call, he advised me not to contact anyone involved with the transaction until more information had been gathered. That sounded reasonable, but emotions are rarely reasonable. The moment I ended the call, I dialed Daniel again. This time he answered. His voice sounded cheerful, with music playing somewhere in the background. "Mom," he said, "I told you I would explain everything after the wedding." I could barely contain myself. I asked him how he could possibly justify what had happened. There was a pause before he sighed heavily, almost as if I were the one creating unnecessary stress. He told me I was overreacting and that the house was simply an asset that would have become his eventually anyway. He insisted the money had been used for something meaningful that the entire family would benefit from in the future. I reminded him that nothing belonged to him while I was still alive and that every decision should have been mine. His response was colder than anything I had ever heard from him. He said I was being selfish by refusing to support the most important day of his life. Before I could answer, Ashley's voice appeared in the background. She laughed softly and said loud enough for me to hear, "Tell her she should be happy we are giving the family something beautiful to celebrate." I felt tears filling my eyes, not because of the money or even the house, but because neither of them sounded guilty. They sounded annoyed. Daniel returned to the phone and asked me one favor. He said the wedding was only 3 days away and begged me not to embarrass them by making accusations before the ceremony. He promised we could work everything out afterward. I quietly asked him one final question. "Did you ever stop and think about what this would do to me?" There was another silence. Then he answered in a voice I barely recognized. "You will understand eventually." The line went dead. I remained sitting in my car for several minutes, staring through the windshield without seeing anything. That was the exact moment something inside me changed. I realized I had spent the entire day hoping my son would remember the values I had raised him with. Instead, he had shown me exactly who he had become. The following morning, I walked into Mr. Harper's office carrying every document he had requested, unaware that one overlooked detail hidden among those papers was about to unravel the entire plan. The next morning I arrived at Michael Harper's office carrying a worn leather folder that had followed me through decades of my life. Inside were tax returns, old mortgage papers, my passport, my driver's license, and even birthday cards that still contained handwritten notes from years ago. Michael greeted me with a calm professionalism that immediately made me feel a little less alone. He carefully compared my authentic signatures to the ones used on the property sale and the bank withdrawals. At first glance they looked convincing, but the longer he studied them, the more differences he circled with a red pen. He pointed out that I always wrote my middle initial with a slight curve, while the disputed signatures used a perfectly straight line. My capital letters leaned slightly to the right, but the forged versions stood almost perfectly upright. They were details I had never consciously noticed about my own handwriting, yet they appeared consistently across documents spanning more than 30 years. Michael then opened another file that changed everything. The identification presented at the real estate closing included a copy of a driver's license with my name and address, but the photograph was noticeably older than my current license. Even more surprising, the identification number did not exactly match the one issued by the state. One digit had been altered. Michael explained that whoever prepared the paperwork had done an impressive job, but they had relied on outdated records and overlooked a detail that would not survive a thorough review. Then another discovery surfaced. The notary whose seal appeared on several closing documents had already submitted an affidavit stating she had no independent recollection of meeting me. After reviewing her appointment log, she realized the meeting had been scheduled under unusual circumstances by someone other than the supposed seller. Surveillance footage from the office parking lot had also been preserved because the building routinely stored recordings for several weeks. Michael believed the footage might confirm who actually arrived for the closing. Suddenly, what had seemed like an impossible situation began transforming into a case supported by evidence rather than emotion. He contacted the bank while I sat across from his desk, and together they compared timestamps from the financial transactions with my known activities. One withdrawal had been processed while I was attending a charity luncheon where dozens of people, including photographs with timestamps, confirmed my presence. Another transaction occurred while I was visiting my physician for a scheduled annual checkup. Piece by piece, the timeline simply did not fit the claim that I had personally authorized everything. By early afternoon, Michael leaned back in his chair and quietly said something I will never forget. "Mrs. Collins, whoever planned this accounted for almost everything except ordinary human habits. They copied your signature, but they could not copy your life." Those words gave me strength I had not felt since this nightmare began. Before I left his office, Michael explained that he had already contacted the title insurance company and advised the appropriate authorities that the transaction was under formal review. He also warned me that once this process began, the people responsible would likely realize the situation had changed. They might try to persuade me to remain quiet or convince me to delay any action until after the wedding. As if on cue, my phone vibrated while I was walking toward my car. It was a text from Daniel asking if I would please attend the ceremony because everyone was expecting me. Attached was a smiling photograph of him and Ashley during their rehearsal dinner, completely unaware that the foundation beneath their perfect celebration had already begun to crack. The morning of the wedding arrived with bright sunshine, as if the world had decided it was going to be a perfect day regardless of what was about to happen. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel as a little boy running through our backyard, laughing as though nothing could ever separate us. Then I would remember the empty bank account, the strangers inside my home, and the message telling me not to make a scene. Around 9 o'clock, Michael Harper called to let me know that investigators had finished reviewing the most critical evidence. The surveillance footage from the title office did not show me arriving for the closing. Instead, it showed another woman entering with Daniel. Although the image was not perfect, it was clear enough to establish that I had not personally appeared to complete the sale. Combined with the signature analysis, the identification discrepancies, the timeline of my documented whereabouts, and the bank records, there was now enough information for the authorities to take immediate action. Michael asked me one final question. He wanted to know whether I still intended to attend the wedding. I looked at the invitation sitting on my kitchen table and quietly answered yes. Not because I wanted revenge or public embarrassment, but because I wanted to hear the truth with my own ears. When I arrived at the venue that afternoon, everything looked exactly the way Ashley had always dreamed. Elegant flowers lined the entrance, a string quartet played softly, and guests admired the decorations while taking photographs. I recognized many familiar faces. Friends, relatives, former neighbors, and coworkers all smiled politely as I walked inside. Some of them seemed surprised that I had come. Daniel spotted me from across the room and immediately hurried over. For a brief second, I saw relief on his face. He hugged me lightly and whispered that he knew I would eventually understand. I looked into his eyes, searching for the son I had spent my life raising, but all I saw was someone desperately trying to protect the story he had created. Before I could respond, Michael entered the venue accompanied by 2 investigators dressed in professional business attire. They did not rush. They did not raise their voices. They simply approached the event coordinator and quietly requested to speak with Daniel in a private room. Conversations around the reception began to slow as people noticed the unexpected visitors. Ashley walked over with a puzzled expression, asking whether something was wrong. Michael calmly introduced himself and explained that there were serious legal questions concerning several financial and real estate documents connected to recent transactions. Daniel's confidence disappeared almost instantly. He insisted there had to be some misunderstanding and claimed everything had been handled properly. One investigator asked whether he would be willing to answer a few questions and review several documents. Michael then placed copies of the disputed signatures beside authentic samples from my personal records. He pointed out the inconsistencies that experts had already documented. Another investigator explained that surveillance footage, financial records, and witness statements did not support the version of events presented during the property transfer. The room became completely silent. Ashley looked from the papers to Daniel, waiting for him to deny everything with confidence. Instead, he struggled to explain details that no longer fit together. He claimed I had verbally approved everything, but when asked why formal records indicated I had personally attended meetings that independent evidence proved I had never attended, he had no clear answer. Several family members quietly stepped away, realizing this was no simple misunderstanding. The ceremony was postponed as venue staff respectfully asked guests to remain patient. I stood near the doorway without saying a single word. I did not need to argue or accuse anyone. The evidence was finally speaking for itself. As Daniel looked toward me, there was no anger in my heart, only sadness. He had spent months believing I would stay silent because I loved him too much to challenge him. He never imagined that the truth would arrive before the vows were ever spoken. In the days that followed the wedding incident, my life became a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer trying to prove that something had happened. I was no longer walking into offices with documents in my hands, hoping someone would believe me. The truth was finally being recognized, but the reality of what my own son had done was much harder to accept than any financial loss. Michael Harper continued working with the investigators and the title company to resolve the situation. The property transfer was placed under review, and the legal process to restore my ownership moved forward. The house that had carried my family's memories for more than 4 decades was eventually returned to me after the transaction was determined to be invalid. Walking through my front door again was one of the most emotional moments of my life. The rooms looked exactly the same, but I felt different. The walls held memories of birthdays, holidays, and quiet evenings with my husband, but they also carried the painful reminder that the person I trusted most had been willing to take those memories away from me. The financial investigation also continued. The bank records showed that the money had been used to cover wedding expenses, deposits, and other purchases connected to Daniel and Ashley's plans. The accounts were reviewed carefully, and through the legal process, a significant portion of the funds was recovered. It was not the money that mattered most to me. What hurt was knowing that Daniel had looked at everything I had built and saw it as something available for him to claim. A few weeks later, Daniel finally asked to meet with me. He arrived at my house looking completely different from the confident person I had seen at the wedding venue. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where he used to do homework as a child. For a moment, I saw the little boy I remembered. Then I remembered the choices he had made. He apologized, but his words were mixed with explanations. He talked about pressure, expectations, and how everything had gotten out of control. He said he never intended for things to become this serious. I listened quietly because I wanted to understand, but understanding did not mean pretending nothing happened. I told him that the hardest part was not losing money or nearly losing my home. The hardest part was realizing he had convinced himself that my love for him meant I would accept anything. Daniel lowered his eyes and admitted he thought I would forgive him because I was his mother. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. He had mistaken unconditional love for permission. Ashley eventually stopped contacting me. According to Daniel, the relationship that had seemed so perfect began falling apart after the truth became public. The wedding plans, the expensive arrangements, and the image they had worked so hard to create no longer mattered when trust disappeared. I never celebrated their struggles because I knew what it felt like to lose something important. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I changed my security arrangements, organized my finances more carefully, and surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Some family members asked whether I would ever forgive Daniel completely. I did not have an easy answer. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. It is not pretending the pain never happened. It is accepting that the past cannot be changed while choosing how to move forward. I still loved my son, but I also learned that love requires boundaries. The day I got my home back was not the day everything was fixed. It was the day I finally understood that protecting my own peace was not selfish. It was necessary. Months have passed since the day everything changed, and I have learned that rebuilding a life is not about returning to the way things were. It is about creating something new from the pieces you still have. When I look around my home now, I see the same walls, the same windows, and the same garden where I spent countless mornings with a cup of coffee in my hands. But I also see something different. I see a woman who finally understood her own value. For many years, I believed being a good mother meant always putting my child first. I believed love meant giving without hesitation, forgiving without limits, and trusting without question. Those beliefs carried me through difficult years, and they helped me raise Daniel into the person I once believed he would always remain. But I learned that love without boundaries can sometimes leave you vulnerable. Today, I keep my heart open, but I also protect the life I worked so hard to build. I started making small changes that helped me feel in control again. I reorganized my finances, updated my legal documents, and surrounded myself with friends who reminded me that I was more than a mother. I was a person with dreams, memories, and a future of my own. Linda, the friend I had lunch with on the day everything happened, became one of my strongest sources of support. She often reminded me that surviving a difficult chapter does not mean the story is over. There are still beautiful pages waiting to be written. Daniel and I have spoken a few times since that difficult conversation at my kitchen table. Our relationship is not the same, and I do not pretend that it is. Trust is something that takes years to build and only moments to damage. I told him that if he truly wanted a relationship with me again, it would have to be based on honesty and accountability. I would always be his mother, but I could no longer ignore my own needs just to make things easier for him. For the first time, Daniel seemed to understand that forgiveness was not something he could demand. It was something he had to earn through his actions. I do not know exactly what the future holds for us. Maybe one day we will find a stronger relationship built on honesty and respect. Maybe it will take more time than either of us expects. But I have stopped forcing answers before they are ready. I have learned to accept what I cannot control. The hardest lesson was realizing that losing my trust in someone I loved was more painful than losing anything material. A house can be repaired. Money can be replaced. But rebuilding a broken bond requires patience, humility, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. When I think back to the woman standing outside her own home, confused and heartbroken, I wish I could tell her something. I would tell her that she was stronger than she realized. I would tell her that one person's choices could not erase a lifetime of kindness, sacrifice, and love. I would tell her that protecting herself did not make her cold. It made her wise. My home is no longer just a place where I keep my belongings. It is a reminder of everything I survived and everything I learned. Every morning, I open the windows, water the flowers, and enjoy the quiet moments I once took for granted. I cannot change what happened, but I can choose what happens next. And after everything, that choice belongs to me.